So in this presentation, we are going to talk about why leadership matters in organizations today, and what is the evidence to suggest that studying leadership is meaningful for today's organizations. What's the empirical evidence? Basically, why should we care? Well, we know from the research evidence that leaders do matter, and one of the easiest ways to think about it is think about a time when you've had a bad manager or a bad boss, someone who just made you feel terrible and made your life a living hell when you showed up for work. Well, that right there suggests to pretty much everyone that leaders do matter. And we know they matter because the research evidence suggests that bad bosses not only cost us in time and money and energy, but they physically make us sick. In fact, there's lots of research out there that we'll talk about this semester that suggests that bad leaders cost us in terms of producing bad health. And one example is the effect that bad leaders have on something like coronary heart disease. There's one study that shows that people with bad leaders end up having more heart attacks every year than those who do not. So clearly we know that leadership matters, and perhaps the easiest way to think about it is just think about all of those bad leaders that you have, and it's pretty easy to see why leaders do matter. So what do I mean by leadership? We typically think of leadership, or we traditionally thought of leadership as basically power, prestige, someone in a position of authority who may have been elected or may have gotten there through other means, and they pretty much keep that position of leadership because of their level of power that they have accumulated and wheeled around. Folks like The Godfather, for example. Well, nowadays that's kind of an outdated model, because the days of working for an organization for 30 years, getting your gold watch and you retire, those are pretty much gone. People don't stay around in organizations. CEOs don't stick around in organizations. In fact, the average CEO tenure in today's organization is about 2 years. What we know today in terms of who becomes a leader, who is judged to be an effective leader, who emerges as leaders, are the folks who basically are the problem solvers. Folks like this guy. These are the folks who solve the problems of today's world. And what we know, if you're interested, this is MacGyver, who I may be dating myself here. What we know from research today is that the people who tend to emerge as leaders tend to be the folks who solve complex problems. And these are the folks who emerge as leaders because other people are looking to them. They're looking to their guidance to help them solve the problems of the world today. So if you're interested in becoming a leader, or being noticed as a leader, or being perceived as a leader, one of the easiest ways is simply go do something. Go do some type of complex task. Other people will take notice of your accomplishment of that task, and they'll start to look to you for answers. Well, that's good news for us today in today's organizations, because that means that we can move up pretty quickly in organizations today simply by accomplishing complex tasks that require leadership abilities. And that's something we're going to talk a lot more later this semester as well. One of the things I'm going to emphasize throughout the rest of the semester as well is that the way in which leadership is enacted, or the way we think about leadership, is different in the U.S. compared to other parts of the world. And we know this thanks to a set of studies called the Globe Studies by a guy named Bob House and his colleagues, who at this point have collected thousands and thousands of surveys from leaders around the globe as well as their followers in about 60-something countries, I think, by now. there are two really key differences that kind of stand out in terms of leadership differences around the world. And to illustrate this, I've included this graph right here simply to illustrate two of these major differences. One is we know that in the U.S., Americans tend to be pretty assertive. Now, a lot of people confuse assertiveness with aggressiveness. Aggressive is more of a negative thing intending to cause harm to somebody. Assertiveness means we're willing to speak up when we need to, and we're willing to say things when we see that something needs to be changed or something needs to happen in response to whatever it is we're seeing. In America, we have a pretty easy time being assertive, and you can see that here on the U.S. in this bar graph right here. Well, contrast that with other cultures, for example, South Korean cultures, East Asian cultures, who tend to rank a little bit lower on assertiveness because of the lack of willingness or the lack of ability to speak up when things are perceived as inaccurate or wrong. And let me give you an example. In Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, he gives a really interesting example of Korean Airlines a few years ago was having a hard time with their airplanes crashing. And they had a team of U.S. investigators study the black boxes from these airplanes that kept crashing. And what they found was pretty interesting. The co-pilots in these cases weren't alerting the pilots when something bad was about to happen. For example, hey, there's a mountain coming up, we should pull up. And what they found, they thought that was pretty interesting. Well, the issue that when they started doing a little bit more digging was that in this particular culture, giving bad news is a sign of disrespect. So for the co-pilot to say, hey, you need to be careful, we need to watch out for whatever danger is coming ahead, was considered disrespectful because it was assumed that the older person, or in this case the pilot himself, should know that type of thing. They shouldn't need to be told. So it was seen as rude and disrespectful. So they went in and had to train the Korean airline folks on how to be more assertive because that was just not something that was a part of their culture.